the boy who loved machines. The story of Lamborghini begins in a humble corner of the Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, in an environment where the rhythm of the year was marked by the seasons, the harvests, and the physical effort of families who lived from the land. In that rural landscape, still marked by the austerity left by the First World War, a boy named Ferruccio Lamborghini is born in the year 1916. A boy who from his earliest years begins to show a particular relationship with anything that has gears, pulleys, or fuel. A relationship that gradually separates him from the agricultural destiny his parents had imagined for him. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because it is always special to think that these stories travel from one country to another while you listen to them from within your own routine. Ferruccio grows up in an Italy that advances slowly toward modernity, a country where the towns maintain an almost motionless life, organized around the countryside and trades that have changed very little over generations. In that context, it is expected that children will follow the path of their parents, learn to work the land and ensure the continuity of the family livelihood. However, from a young age, Ferruccio shows that his fascination goes in another direction. Every time an engine sounds several meters away, no matter how small the noise may be, he turns his head, as if that sound held a secret meaning only he could decipher. While other children play in the fields, he approaches any machine he can find, from an old tractor to the rusted engine of some abandoned mechanical tool. His parents, strict farmers who value manual effort above any technical skill, observe with bewilderment how their son is more interested in understanding a shaft than in learning how to sew. And that difference, although they do not consider it dangerous, is difficult for them to accept. Even so, Ferruccio manages to accompany blacksmiths, small local mechanics, and any craftsman who has a noisy forge or an open engine spread across a metal table. In those small rural workshops, he begins to discover a world that does not resemble the tasks of the countryside at all. A world where movement arises from pieces that fit together, where noise has logic, and where mental effort is as valuable as physical effort. At the end of the decade of 1920, when he is already almost an adolescent, the difference between him and the young people of his age becomes impossible to ignore. While his neighbors learn to read the land, Ferruccio learns to read machinery. He observes disassembled engines as if they were maps, studies the way pieces transmit force, and is amazed at the precision with which an apparently simple structure can generate continuous movement. That discovery accompanies him everywhere, to the field, to the house, to the improvised workshops where he spends more time than his parents would like. Each new experience confirms that his mind works better surrounded by tools than by crops. The rural environment, so stable for others, feels small for Ferruccio, because the routine of the countryside does not offer the kind of challenges that make him feel alive. He needs to understand, dismantle, rebuild, make mistakes, try again, and, above all, discover what more can be achieved with an engine if it is pushed a little beyond what is established. And although in those years there is still no sign that he will found a legendary brand, the seed of that spirit that will later turn him into a bold entrepreneur is already visible. That mixture of inexhaustible curiosity, iron stubbornness, and the desire to master mechanics as if it were his own language. As time passes, Ferruccio's relationship with machinery becomes so evident that even those around him begin to accept it as part of his identity, even if they do not fully understand what future a rural boy with his mind fixed on engines might have in a time when Italy still lives more from what it grows than from what it manufactures. However, he continues moving forward without the need for great plans. He simply follows that internal impulse that drives him to search for pieces, tools, and engines to work on, making sure to learn something new each time. The decade advances, and the country begins to transform slowly, driven by industrialization which, although uneven, is already becoming noticeable in certain regions, and Ferruccio observes these changes with a mixture of enthusiasm and expectation. The technical world becomes broader, the machines more complex, and the young Lamborghini feels clearly that his place is on the side of those who will build this new Italy that is beginning to rise, an Italy where machines will cease to be a rarity and will become the driving force of progress. Without even knowing it, those years mark the emotional and technical foundation of all the decisions he will make in his adult life. The combination of rural work, constant mechanical observation, and the desire to understand what others took for granted ends up shaping the character with which he will face the challenges to come, challenges that will test his ingenuity, his endurance, and his ambition, and that will push him much further than anyone imagined for that boy born in the year 1916. And so, from this childhood marked by the contrast between the land and mechanics, the personality begins to take shape of the man who will forever change the way the world understands power, engineering, and luxury on wheels. A path that will soon lead him to a place where demand, discipline, and speed will become protagonists. Forging talent in war. When Ferruccio Lamborghini enters youth, Europe is already walking toward one of the darkest periods in its history, and that unstoppable advance toward global conflict will end up dragging him into a setting very different from the fields of Emilia-Romagna, where he had grown up among improvised engines and borrowed tools. At the end of the decade of 1930, the young man who had become accustomed to digging into the mechanics of any machine that crossed his path begins to understand that his ability has a value that goes beyond personal curiosity, and soon the historical context will take charge of testing him in a drastic manner, because war turns mechanics into a matter of survival and strategy, and that will be the environment where his talent takes on a much more defined form. Italy enters the Second World War in 1940, aligned with the Axis powers, and like so many other young Italians, Ferruccio is called to serve, leaving behind rural life and the familiar rhythm of the countryside to enter a world in which discipline, hierarchy, and conflict become the daily norm. However, the difference is that he does not arrive as a simple soldier without direction, but as someone with a clear technical foundation, someone who has developed a special instinct for understanding engines, and that detail soon leads to his assignment to mechanical work within the army. Faced with military vehicles, transport trucks, generators, and diverse machinery, Ferruccio finds himself in an environment where his ability to dismantle, diagnose, and repair stops being a peculiarity and becomes an urgent necessity. War does not offer him a comfortable workshop or tools neatly organized on shelves. On the contrary, it places him in situations where spare parts are scarce, time is minimal, and mistakes are costly. During those years, especially when he is sent to the island of Rhodes in the Aegean Sea, Ferruccio becomes a sort of field doctor for wounded engines, taking charge of repairing vehicles in extreme conditions. He works outdoors, on the ground, in improvised hangars, surrounded by noise and tension, aware that every truck he manages to get running, every engine he brings back to life, can mean supplies, mobility, and, in many cases, a real difference in the logistical front. This kind of pressure shapes his character because it teaches him to make quick decisions, to improvise with whatever is available, and to refuse to give up on machines that, at first glance, seem condemned to be scrapped. The war years form a brutal but extremely effective school. Ferruccio learns to work with engines of different sizes and origins, from Italian vehicles to foreign models captured or adapted, and that forces him to master varied technologies, disparate operating schemes, and creative solutions to fit together parts that, in theory, were not designed to be together. Alongside mechanical skill, he develops a very sharp kind of mechanical intuition, the ability to listen to an engine and detect the problem almost before opening the hood, something that will later become one of his greatest strengths as a machinery and automobile entrepreneur. The wartime context also teaches him to manage teams, because one man alone cannot repair an entire fleet, and Ferruccio, over time, ends up coordinating other mechanics, organizing tasks and assigning priorities according to strategic urgency. This early leadership experience has a direct impact on his future role as an entrepreneur, as it accustoms him to making decisions, taking responsibility, and keeping calm while everything around him seems chaotic. In war, orders come and go, logistics grow complicated at every moment, but someone has to ensure that the machines keep working, and the name Lamborghini begins to fit that role quite well. The end of war, however, does not arrive like a door slamming shut, but like a slow process marked by defeat, occupation, and the political reconfiguration of Europe. After the Italian armistice of 1943, the situation becomes even more confusing, with changes in command, troop realignments, and a climate of constant uncertainty. Ferruccio goes through phases of being a prisoner and a forced laborer, like so many Italian soldiers who become trapped in the middle of negotiations and movements of the Allied powers. In that period of captivity, far from home and with an uncertain future, his link to mechanics remains his anchor, because the victors also need working vehicles, and valuable technicians remain valuable even if the uniform of those giving orders changes. Between 1944 and 1946, while Europe tries to rebuild its map and redefine its borders, Ferruccio accumulates practical experience at a pace that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He repairs engines in improvised facilities, adapts to new work rules, works alongside mechanics from other countries, and observes different ways of organizing maintenance and logistics. Each day becomes a lesson in efficiency, adaptation, and resilience. Three concepts that will later become inseparable from his way of understanding business and industry. When he finally returns to Italy in 1946, he finds a devastated country, with destroyed infrastructure, damaged factories, and a population attempting to rebuild life among material ruins and emotional wounds. Many return without a clear direction, carrying heavy memories and unsure of how to transform their wartime experiences. But Ferruccio returns with a very defined conviction. He knows that his place is in the world of machines. He knows he has a technical advantage over many others, and he senses, almost instinctively, that the reconstruction of the country will require engines, vehicles, and tools on a massive scale. War has taken years of youth from him, but it has given him something very specific in return, a sort of unofficial degree in engineering applied to survival. The contrast between the countryside of his childhood and the destroyed Italy of the post-war era is enormous. But where others see only misery and scarcity, he detects the presence of an immense opportunity. The remains of military machinery, abandoned trucks, damaged engines, everything that seems like worthless scrap to many begins to take on a different meaning in his mind, because he understands that, with ingenuity and hard work, it can be transformed into something useful for the country's new reality. This ability to look at chaos and see a project, to look at ruin and see raw material, will be one of the traits that define his identity as an entrepreneur. In those years of return and adjustment, Ferruccio is no longer the curious teenager fascinated by any machine. He is a man shaped by the pressure of war, hardened by military discipline, trained to solve mechanical problems in extreme contexts, and accustomed to living under constant responsibility. That background prepares him for the next step in his life, a step that will lead him to build something of his own, to take everything he learned in improvised hangars and battlefields and pour it into an idea that will forever change the agricultural and business landscape of post-war Italy, and that will be the true beginning of his trajectory as a creator of large-scale industrial solutions. Tractors that changed Italy. When Ferruccio Lamborghini returns to Italy in the year 1946, he finds a broken country, with fields waiting to be cultivated, towns full of scars, and an economy trying to rise with the strength it has left, and it is precisely in the middle of that mix of need, precariousness, and desire for reconstruction where his mind begins to work with a new clarity, because he understands that the experience accumulated among military engines and war machinery can become an enormous advantage in an environment where every tool matters. The country is hungry, it needs to produce, and to produce it needs something more than human hands. It needs machines, particularly tractors capable of multiplying the effort of the land in a time when every hectare was vital to move forward. Ferruccio observes that reality with a combination of rawness and pragmatic optimism, because he sees farmers still depending on oxen, mules, and traditional plows, while at the same time knowing that in Italy and in the rest of Europe there are enormous quantities of unused military vehicles, truck engines, tank parts, gears, differentials, and components that have lost their war function but still hold very clear mechanical value for someone with his training. In that contrast between the need of the countryside and the abundance of military scrap, the idea begins to take shape that will give rise to his first great industrial empire, taking those remnants of war, transforming them, and turning them into machines of peace, machines created to work the land. In the year 1948, Ferruccio takes a decisive step and founds in Cento, in the province of Ferrara, his own tractor manufacturing company, Lamborghini Trattori, a venture that many would consider risky, but that for him makes perfect sense, because it brings together everything he knows well: mechanics, real market need, and a political context willing to encourage the modernization of the countryside. His first model, named Carioca, is born precisely from the reuse of military components, mainly reconstructed truck engines adapted for agricultural work, combined with transmission systems and chassis specifically designed to withstand the continuous effort required of a tractor. The result is not a luxury machine, but a robust, reliable, and relatively affordable tool for the farmers of the time. Ferruccio's intelligence does not reside solely in the workshop, but also in his reading of the historical moment, because he understands that the post-war period is full of incentives and programs through which the Italian government is trying to promote the mechanization of the countryside, offering aid, credit, and facilities so that farmers can acquire machinery. He positions himself exactly at the point where those public subsidies, the needs of farmers, and the possibility of producing tractors in series using raw material that others consider scrap all intersect. From the very beginning, he designs his company with a very clear mindset: produce reliable machines, easy to maintain, and adapted to the economic reality of a country that has little money but great urgency to move forward. In the day-to-day of the factory, Ferruccio involves himself beyond the role of owner, because his nature as a mechanic pushes him to personally supervise the assembly processes, correct details, test engines, and listen to the sound of the tractors before they reach the market. He knows that the success of his company depends on those machines enduring long days on difficult terrain, with limited maintenance, and in the hands of people who, in many cases, have never worked with complex engines before. That is why he insists that the tractors be resistant and as simple as possible in their operation, and he creates a production system that, although still modest compared to large industrial powers, begins to gain speed and coherence with surprising quickness. As the 1950s advance, the reputation of Lamborghini Trattori grows in the region and later in much of the country, thanks to word of mouth from the farmers themselves, who find in those machines a tool that completely transforms their daily lives. A field that once required an enormous amount of manual labor over long weeks can now be worked in much less time, allowing productivity to increase, physical effort to decrease, and new economic opportunities to open for entire families. Every tractor leaving the factory is not simply a new machine on the market. It is a piece of national reconstruction, a silent symbol of how technical ingenuity can accelerate the recovery of a wounded country. Ferruccio also knows how to take care of the relationship with his customers, because he understands better than anyone the language of effort, sacrifice, and the need for concrete results. He too comes from a farming family and knows the value of every lira a farmer decides to invest. So he takes care of after-sales service, availability of spare parts, and technical support, ensuring that the Lamborghini name is associated from the beginning with reliability and commitment. Before being a surname linked to luxury and supercars, Lamborghini is, during those years, the name of a tractor that starts in the morning and shuts off when there is almost no light left, the work companion of those who pull the country forward from their own land. At the business level, the evolution of Lamborghini Trattori is equally interesting, because Ferruccio moves from reusing military parts to developing his own components, investing in engineering and increasingly sophisticated production lines, expanding the range of models to adapt to different farm sizes and diverse market needs. That transition from workshop that recycles to factory that designs and manufactures in series marks a fundamental mindset shift, because it forces him to better organize his structure, hire more personnel, standardize processes, and interact with suppliers in an increasingly professional and demanding way. The figure of the entrepreneur taking shape in him becomes evident in this stage, because Ferruccio stops being only the brilliant mechanic who repairs and adapts, and becomes a true industrialist who thinks about scalability, efficiency, costs, and margins, without losing his technical roots, but with a growing ability to delegate and lead. The combination of workshop and office, of grease on the hands and numbers on paper, creates an uncommon profile in that post-war Italy. A profile that places him, almost without realizing it, at the forefront of a new generation of Italian entrepreneurs who understand mechanics as an economic tool of the highest order. In terms of impact, Lamborghini tractors help transform the productive landscape of many rural areas, accelerating mechanization and freeing labor that, over time, will be able to move toward new activities, contributing to the industrial development of the country. That dynamic, which may seem simple in the moment, is in reality a key piece of the Italian economic evolution of the mid-20th century. Agriculture becomes more efficient, and that creates a more solid base upon which to build factories, workshops, and new businesses. And right there, in that flow of transformation, Ferruccio begins to ask himself what else he could do with all that accumulated experience. At this stage of his life, Lamborghini has already demonstrated that he is capable of detecting a critical need, designing a mechanical solution, and turning it into a profitable business with a recognized brand and a serious production structure. And that certainty acts as internal fuel that pushes him to think bigger, to look beyond the fields and tractors, toward other sectors where mechanics, power, and design can continue opening unexpected paths for him. The tireless entrepreneur. At the beginning of the decade of 1950, while the Lamborghini tractors begin to appear in many Italian fields, Ferruccio finds himself for the first time in his life in a position that combines economic stability, professional prestige, and a very particular sense of control over his destiny. And far from inviting him to settle down, that situation awakens an even greater restlessness, because in his mind the tractor company is not an ending point, but the first solid step from which he can look toward other industrial opportunities. The post-war period is gradually being left behind. The Italian economy begins to enter a stage of development, and both the cities and the rural areas demand new technical solutions for everyday problems, from the heating of homes to the modernization of workshops and industrial buildings, a field that, in the eyes of a mechanic with the mentality of an entrepreneur, appears full of possibilities. Ferruccio observes attentively how the country changes. Italy becomes industrialized, new factories appear, working-class neighborhoods grow, energy needs increase, and gradually, life begins to become less rustic and more technological. In that scenario, his experience with engines, transmissions, and mechanical systems places him in a privileged position to detect market niches that others do not see clearly. The mentality he has developed during the years of war and post-war pushes him toward a firm conclusion. Depending on a single line of business is too risky for someone accustomed to uncertainty, which leads him to diversify, to expand into other sectors related to energy, heating, and hydraulic systems. Beginning in the middle of the decade of 1950, in addition to consolidating Lamborghini Trattori, he creates companies dedicated to the manufacture of gas and fuel oil burners, boilers, and industrial and domestic heating systems, activities that may seem less glamorous than the idea we now associate with his surname, but which at that time are fundamental for a country seeking to modernize its houses, its factories, and its public buildings. These new companies, such as Lamborghini Bruciatori and other complementary initiatives, benefit from a mental structure that Ferruccio has perfected through trial and error. Detecting a real need, relying on his technical ability, surrounding himself with capable people, and from there, building a scalable industrial solution. Inside his factories, the atmosphere reflects the personality he has polished over the years, tough but pragmatic, demanding but results-oriented. Ferruccio is a boss who walks through the workshops, looks into the assembly lines, intervenes in the details, and speaks with workers and engineers without establishing a rigid frontier between the one wearing work overalls and the one wearing a suit, because he comes from both worlds and feels comfortable in that mixture. He demands precision, speed, and responsibility, but he also earns respect for something the workers value greatly. He understands firsthand what it takes to make a machine work well and does not disdain the physical effort of those who build it. That combination of technical authority and entrepreneurial vision generates an intense corporate culture, in which people work hard, but also feel they are part of a project that is growing. With each new contract and each new machine installed in a factory or a building, the figure of Ferruccio becomes the prototype of the modern industrialist of post-war Italy, a man who does not come from economic aristocracy, but from direct experience with mechanics and war, and who has learned to translate that knowledge into products with demand. Wealth begins to arrive more evidently, and with it, a considerable improvement in his lifestyle. Larger houses, properties, meetings with other influential entrepreneurs, and, of course, access to high-end cars that travel along the Italian roads during the explosion of the automobile as a symbol of status and personal success. His taste for powerful and well-built cars does not appear out of nowhere. It is nourished by an entire life dedicated to engines, and by an era in which Italy becomes one of the most important cradles of the sports automobile. Brands such as Maserati, Alfa Romeo, and of course Ferrari represent a technological and emotional ideal for those who have money, passion for driving, and a certain need to express their economic triumph through four wheels. And Ferruccio fits perfectly into this profile. As a prosperous entrepreneur, he allows himself to acquire several exclusive cars, among them models from Ferrari, which at that time are already perceived as the summit of grand touring high-performance automobiles. However, his relationship with these automobiles is not only that of a customer who enjoys speed, but that of a technician who listens to noises, feels vibrations, detects defects, and notices details that most people overlook. From the perspective of Ferrari, that man is just another buyer. But from the perspective of Lamborghini, each car becomes an object of study, a set of solutions and problems that he analyzes with the same gaze with which he examines a tractor or a boiler. That way of experiencing success, examining and questioning even what is considered perfect, reveals how deeply his mentality belongs to someone who never feels satisfied with what already exists. While his companies strengthen and generate constant income, Ferruccio develops a key trait for any entrepreneur who aspires to remain relevant: the ability to reinvest, to take risks, to increase calculated risk instead of retreating into the comfort of secure money. He expands facilities, improves production machinery, hires qualified engineers, and maintains a philosophy of growth that avoids stagnation, something that for him would be almost a form of living death. His biography in those years is a continuous succession of long days, quick decisions, and constant trips between factories, offices, suppliers, and clients, always accompanied by the murmur of engines, whether agricultural diesel engines, industrial heating systems, or high-end automobiles. On a personal level, the figure of Ferruccio reflects a curious mixture of enriched peasant and industrial gentleman, someone who understands the value of humble work, but who intensely enjoys the fruits of his success. He feels no guilt for having a good table, a good house, and a good car, because he knows that behind each of those luxuries there are years of grease on the hands, sleepless nights, uncertain decisions, and a war that forced him to grow up too quickly. That direct relationship between effort and reward nourishes an internal confidence that, over time, will become the necessary spark to challenge consolidated giants in other sectors. This stage of business diversification reveals Lamborghini at his most mature, less improvisational than in his beginnings, but just as ambitious and, above all, very accustomed to seeing his ideas work when executed with discipline. He has learned to move in the world of banks, loans, investments, and negotiations with the state, without losing his bond with the workshop. And that dual fluency, both economic and technical, creates the perfect ground for his mind to begin to consider greater challenges in a field that already fascinates him deeply. That of the luxury sports automobile, that world where the engine stops being only a work tool and becomes an emotional experience. And while the chimneys of his factories continue to release smoke and the tractors and heating systems that bear his surname multiply across Italy, within him begins to grow the idea that his story with engines has not yet reached its highest point, an intuition that will gradually lead him toward a decision capable of altering the history of the automobile forever. The disagreement with Enzo Ferrari. At the end of the 1950s in Italy, the surname Lamborghini already meant reliability, well-executed work, and business success, but it was not yet linked to the universe of the sports automobile, and yet the man who carried that surname traveled more and more often behind the wheel of machines that inspired admiration on any road. Ferruccio had developed an intense taste for powerful and elegant cars capable of turning each journey into an experience, and in that context it was inevitable that he would end up buying several Ferrari automobiles, because at that moment, the brand from Maranello represented the highest dream of the passionate driver who could afford to pay for it. The entrepreneur of tractors and industrial systems allowed himself the luxury of having in his garage some of the most desired grand touring cars in Italy, although for him those cars were not an untouchable collector's item, but machines subjected to constant scrutiny. Ferruccio's relationship with his Ferrari automobiles was not a simple ideal between a satisfied client and a prestigious product. His mind as a trained mechanic detected flaws, debatable mechanical details, and points that could be improved, points that many other users, fascinated by the image of the brand, did not even consider. One of those points, which with time would become legend, was the behavior of the clutch, a component that seemed to break far too often for someone accustomed to the robustness of agricultural and industrial machinery. Every time a clutch failed, he felt a mixture of frustration and technical challenge, because he could not accept that a car of such level, designed by such a prestigious house, could have such an evident weak point. What in another type of buyer would have remained a simple user complaint, in Ferruccio became an almost obsessive need to investigate the problem, to understand what was happening, to verify whether it was an inevitable failure due to the power of the car or an erroneous technical decision. He began to disassemble, to review, to compare components, and he reached the conclusion that the clutch in his Ferrari automobiles was not essentially different from the one he used in his tractors, something that he found unacceptable for a sports automobile of that price level. That realization was not only a mechanical fact, it was a direct provocation to his sense of logic and dignity as a client. From that moment on, the idea of speaking personally with the man responsible for those machines began to grow in his mind. Enzo Ferrari, in those years, was already an almost mythical figure, a character wrapped in a mixture of respect, fear, and admiration within the world of the motor. He directed his company from Maranello with a very particular vision of the automobile, centered on competition, on racing, on the glory of his cars on the circuits, and the road models existed as a consequence of that philosophy of extreme speed. Approaching him to suggest changes was not something anyone dared to do, but Ferruccio was not just anyone. He was a man accustomed to speaking as an equal with military commanders, with bankers, and with authorities, and above all someone who trusted deeply in his technical judgment. Thus, one day, armed with his experience, his determination, and his status as an important client, he decided to visit the Ferrari factory. The image that has remained in history speaks of a meeting filled with tension, a clash of egos between two giants who see the world of mechanics from different angles. Ferruccio presents himself, explains what the problem is, describes the fragility of the clutch in his cars, and dares to propose solutions. He even suggests that, with his experience in heavy machinery, he himself could advise improvements for the component. From his perspective, it is a technical conversation, a tough one, but aimed at optimizing a product he considers extraordinary in many aspects. Enzo Ferrari, however, does not receive him with the spirit of someone willing to listen to an external expert, but with the wounded sensitivity of the creator who feels that his work is being attacked. The Commendatore had spent years building a reputation based on sporting excellence, on the passion for racing, and on the idea that Ferrari represented the summit of the Italian automobile. Direct criticism, and even more so when accompanied by suggestions on how to do things, was unbearable for him. The versions of the exact dialogue vary depending on who tells the story, but the core of the disagreement is always the same. Enzo reminds Ferruccio of his origin as a tractor manufacturer and makes it clear to him, with cutting words, that his technical ability is fine for the field, but not for the world of high-end cars. That phrase, spoken with disdain, has the effect of a shot inside Lamborghini's mind. Suddenly, the industrialist who had allowed himself the luxury of being a client begins to feel belittled, reduced to a caricature of what he truly is. Enzo does not see the technician who has repaired military machinery in extreme conditions, who has built a company crucial for Italian reconstruction, and who has diversified his industrial activity with success. He sees only a man who manufactures tractors, machines considered rough, utilitarian, and not very sophisticated in comparison with his delicate grand touring cars. That look of superiority wounds Ferruccio's pride and activates in him a reaction that will change the course of his life forever. Because in that moment, while he listens to how they pigeonhole him and underestimate him, Ferruccio experiences something that every entrepreneur knows well: the mixture of anger, determination, and clarity that appears when someone tells you that you are not capable of doing something. He does not see that scene as a closure, but as the beginning of a gigantic challenge. If Ferrari considers that a manufacturer of tractors has no right to give an opinion about sports cars, Lamborghini begins to ask himself why he cannot build his own, with his philosophy, with his vision of what a true high-performance grand touring car should be: comfortable, fast, elegant, and with mechanics tuned according to his judgment. When he leaves that meeting, the conflict is no longer only about a clutch that fails. It is about a mental model. Enzo Ferrari represents the figure of the almost untouchable genius who comes from the world of racing and who believes he has the last word on how a high-level car must be. Ferruccio represents the new generation of Italian industrialists who have learned through blows and through work facing the machine, men who do not fear questioning sacred cows if they see a flaw in their work. That clash of visions crystallizes in a decision that matures quickly in Lamborghini's mind. If they do not want to listen to him as a client, he will speak as a competitor. In the days and weeks that follow, while he returns to his factories, walks through his assembly lines and sits in his cars, Ferruccio begins to imagine what type of automobile he would be capable of building with the resources, knowledge, and discipline he already has. He knows that he will need engineers, designers, specific facilities, and many hours of work, but he also knows that he possesses something that few people in his position have: a combination of economic capital, mechanical experience, and wounded pride that acts as long-lasting fuel. The idea of creating a car capable of reaching the level of Ferrari, and even surpassing it in certain aspects, no longer sounds like fantasy. It begins to settle in his mind as an attainable goal. What initially was a personal disagreement between two strong-willed men will soon become the trigger for a new brand in the world of the automobile. A brand born with the spirit of demonstrating that technical greatness does not belong exclusively to those who have dominated the circuits. And while the daily life of his companies continues its course, Ferruccio begins to move pieces, to gather information, to contact key people, to prepare the ground for a calculated leap into the void that will transform a workshop conflict into an industrial declaration of war, veiled but forceful. The birth of a Defiant brand. When Ferruccio Lamborghini decides that he will build his own sports automobiles, the idea does not appear as a passing whim fueled by a burst of pride, but rather as the logical consequence of an entire life dedicated to mechanics, to business, and to the constant improvement of whatever he had in his hands. Therefore, once the famous argument with Enzo Ferrari is digested, he begins to move with the cold determination of someone who has already made an important decision and knows that, from that moment on, every step must be aimed at turning it into reality. We are at the beginning of the decade of 1960. Italy is experiencing a period of accelerated economic growth. The cities fill with cars, factories, and new highways, and the country becomes an ideal stage for the birth of a brand that aspires to compete in the most exclusive segment of the automobile market. Lamborghini carefully chooses the place from which he will launch his challenge. Sant'Agata Bolognese, a small town in Emilia-Romagna, strategically located between Modena and Bologna, in the very heart of the so-called Italian Motor Valley, where workshops, historic brands, and an almost fanatical culture for everything related to engines coexist. There he purchases a piece of land and begins to build from scratch a factory that is not an improvised warehouse, but a modern, bright, and orderly complex designed to convey from the very first day a clear message. In that place, every detail is taken care of. Unlike many companies that are born in garages or adapted storage spaces, Automobili Ferruccio Lamborghini is conceived from the outset as a serious, planned industrial reality that reflects both the ambition of its founder and his previous experience in the world of tractors and heating systems. The project cannot rely solely on Ferruccio's energy and money. It needs pure technical talent, engineers capable of translating his ideas into metal, bolts, and pistons. Thus, he surrounds himself with a young and ambitious team in which stand out names that, with time, will become legendary. Gianpaolo Dallara, Paolo Stanzani, Giotto Bizzarini in the initial phase of the project, among others. He contributes the global vision, the entrepreneurial instinct, and a very defined criterion about what he wants as a grand touring user. While they bring with them the fresh knowledge of modern engineering, experience in competition, and a professional hunger that fits perfectly with the defiant tone of the new brand. In the offices and workshops of Sant'Agata, that special combination of mature authority and young talent blends together, the same mixture that is often behind great leaps in innovation. From the beginning, Lamborghini makes it clear that his automobiles will not be conceived with the same mentality as the Ferraris of that time, because he has a different vision of what a luxury sports car should be. Enzo Ferrari lives obsessed with the track, with the circuit, with victories at Le Mans and in Formula One. For him, Road cars are almost an inevitable consequence to finance his true passion. Ferruccio, on the other hand, wants to create machines designed for enjoyment on the road, for long, fast, and comfortable trips, with powerful engines but also with a refined interior, silent when necessary, equipped so that the driver and passengers can travel hundreds of kilometers without ending up exhausted. His goal is to build the perfect Grand Tourer, a synthesis of performance and comfort, with more civilized mechanics than those of a racing car in disguise. At the image level, he also understands that confronting Ferrari requires more than a good engine. He needs a symbol, a strong visual identity that communicates character, strength, and personality at first glance. He chooses the bull as the brand's emblem, inspired by his own zodiac sign, Taurus, and by his fascination with the power and nobility of the animal. The shield with the charging bull, over a black background, becomes from the beginning a clear message to the market. The cars that emerge from Sant'Agata will not be discreet. They will be made to attract attention, to transmit an aggressive and proud energy, very different from the refined prancing horse of Maranello. It is almost a visual declaration of intent, a way of saying, we are here to compete, to stand our ground, to push forward. While the walls of the factory rise and the offices fill with blueprints, sketches, and technical discussions, Lamborghini pours into the project a series of demands that go beyond the simple specifications of an engine. He wants the workshop to be impeccably clean, the assembly lines to follow an almost surgical logic, and the staff to maintain a high standard of professionalism. He is obsessed with the quality of the finishes, the precision of the adjustments, the sensation the client will have when opening the car door for the first time. He is determined to prove that an industrialist who began among tractors can play in the highest league of luxury without complexes, and that conviction will be reflected both in the processes and in the final result. In parallel, the development of the first prototype advances at great speed, fueled by long meetings in which the founder and his engineers discuss even the smallest detail of the design. It is decided to use a 12-cylinder V-shaped engine, a mechanical heart that immediately symbolizes the ambition of the project, because it is not an engine adapted from another activity, but a completely new power unit designed from scratch to function in a high-performance automobile. This decision involves high costs, technological risks, and a huge investment in development. But Ferruccio considers it essential if he wants his brand to be born with authority, without appearing to be a copy of something already existing. Creating a 12-cylinder engine of their own is like planting a flag at the top of the mountain from day one, even if the path to get there wears everyone down. The first conceptual model, the prototype known as 350 GTV, is conceived almost as an exaggerated business card, a showcase of what the new company is capable of imagining in terms of engine, chassis, and design. Although in this phase there are still many adjustments to be made, and the automobile is not ready for serial production, the message it sends to the automotive world is forceful. Something serious is being forged in Sant'Agata, a manufacturer that does not settle for watered-down versions nor for assembling external components, but rather dares to build its own mechanical architecture to fully enter the conversation of the great names of the Italian automobile industry. On a personal level, Ferruccio lives this stage with special intensity, aware that he is risking more than money and reputation, because this project is also born as a response to a wound of pride, and he wants history to show that his reaction was not a childish outburst, but the strategic decision of someone who knew very well what he was doing. He alternates his responsibilities in the other companies with constant visits to the automobile factory, participates in engine tests, listens to the sound of the 12-cylinder, walks through the plant to make sure that each improvement is applied quickly and corrects any deviation from the quality he has in mind. In his eyes, every advance in Sant'Agata is another piece in the construction of a truth he wants to shout to the world. The tractor manufacturer is capable of making automobiles as good as or better than those of the man who despised him. The official birth of Automobili Lamborghini in 1963 is not, therefore, a simple administrative act nor a festive inauguration. It is the moment in which an idea materializes, an idea that has been growing in silence since the post-war period. That of a man who turned war leftovers into tractors, tractors into wealth, wealth into industrial diversification, and finally that consolidation into a bet to also dominate the territory of luxury automobiles. With the factory running, the team assembled, the bull emblem shining at the entrance, and the prototype ready to be shown, the stage is set for the next step, the one in which a production model must hit the market and convince customers that this new brand truly deserves a place in their garages. The 350 GT, an elegant provocation. When the factory of Sant'Agata Bolognese begins to gain rhythm, and the initial prototype has already fulfilled its function as a declaration of intentions, Ferruccio Lamborghini understands that the moment has arrived to move from the symbolic gesture to the real product, to the car that can be registered, sold, and driven on Italian roads with the solvency of something more than a promise. In that context, the project of the 350 GT is born, the first Grand Tourer produced by Automobili Lamborghini, a model that needed to embody everything its founder had been repeating for a long time: abundant power, discreet elegance, comfort over long distances, and refined mechanics designed for demanding drivers, but not necessarily obsessed with the world of racing. The 350 GT emerges as a more realistic and civilized version of the prototype 350 GTV, which had been presented in an impactful way, but was not prepared for series production. This transformation requires intense work of revision, adjustment, and adaptation, in which the team of engineers refines the 12-cylinder V engine designed by Giotto Bizzarini and configured by Gianpaolo Dallara and Paolo Stanzani, adapting it for the daily use of a Grand Tourer. The power plant remains a highly advanced piece of engineering for the era, with technical solutions taken from racing but adjusted to offer reliability, smoothness, and a less extreme power delivery than that of a pure competition car, because Ferruccio insists that his clients must be able to enjoy the car without feeling exhausted at the end of each journey. The tubular chassis, light and rigid, is combined with carefully designed suspension, with layouts that allow stable and predictable behavior, distancing itself from the excessive stiffness that characterize some sports cars intended almost exclusively for the track. The result is a vehicle capable of devouring kilometers at high speed without sacrificing comfort, something Lamborghini considered fundamental because his idea of a Grand Tourer was based on the image of a business person, a successful professional, or a motoring enthusiast who travels long distances between cities, perhaps for work, perhaps for pleasure, and who wishes to arrive at their destination with the sensation of having enjoyed the drive, but also of having traveled with dignity and comfort. In its aesthetics, the 350 GT calls upon the talent of Carrozzeria Touring, a company with a great reputation in designing elegant automobiles, which is entrusted with drawing a fluid, well-proportioned silhouette, without strident excesses, with a long hood that announces the presence of the 12-cylinder engine and a set-back cabin that visually lengthens the car and gives it a very distinguished presence. It is not an aggressive sports car in the most radical sense of the word. It is a refined Grand Tourer, almost aristocratic, presented as an alternative to the more nervous Berlinettas on the market. That external elegance, united with the bull emblem on the front, sends a very clear message to those who contemplate it. The brand is new, but its visual language conveys maturity and good taste from the very first day. The interior also reflects Ferruccio's obsession with details. With cushioned seats, quality leather, well-arranged instrumentation, and an atmosphere that blends sober luxury with functionality. He had personally experienced what it meant to drive long distances in cars that, despite being fast, were uncomfortable, noisy, and temperamental, which is why he insisted again and again that the cabin of the 350 GT had to be a welcoming place, a space where the driver felt treated with respect, not like a weekend racing pilot forced to endure sacrifices in the name of sportiness. In the selection of materials, in the feel of the steering wheel, in the response of the gearbox, in the driving position, there is a constant search for balance between sporty sensations and well-being. The official presentation of the model, in 1964, generates an immediate impact in the specialized press and among automotive enthusiasts, because that car arriving from Sant'Agata is perceived as something more than an experiment. Journalists highlight the finesse of the engine, the stability of the chassis, the build quality, and the elegance of the bodywork, and many explicitly remark that Lamborghini has not entered the market as an improviser, but as a constructor that has done its homework with a seriousness that surprises, above all because the company is very young. The 350 GT earns early respect that takes other brands years to achieve, and that strengthens the credibility of the project among a very demanding segment of clients. For Ferruccio, each unit delivered to a buyer represents much more than a profitable transaction. It is a gesture of challenge toward Maranello, a silent way to respond to that disparaging phrase from Enzo Ferrari. Each 350 GT driving on an Italian or foreign road is the tangible proof that the man of tractors has been able to enter the Olympus of luxury automobiles with a product worthy of the best, and that sensation acts as emotional fuel that pushes him to continue investing in the brand. What began as a reaction to a personal slight becomes, with the arrival of this model, an economic and technological reality that nobody in the industry can ignore. In business terms, the 350 GT is not produced in large volumes, because Lamborghini does not compete in the terrain of mass manufacturing, but in that of controlled exclusivity. However, sales are solid enough to keep the factory busy and the project alive. More importantly, it attracts a clientele that begins to associate the Lamborghini surname with something very specific. A high-performance grand tourer, comfortable, distinctive, and with an air of daring that sets it apart from already established brands. That positioning, supported by the quality of the product, the elegance of the design, and the founder's personality, is the company's first great strategic achievement. Another relevant consequence emerges within Sant'Agata itself. The success of the 350 GT gives confidence to the engineers, demonstrates that the chosen path is viable, and strengthens the internal culture of a team that feels capable of going further. Once the concept of the refined Grand Tourer is validated, more audacious ideas begin to appear. Proposals that bet on a different architecture, on a more daring engine configuration, on aesthetics that break known rules. The factory is no longer only the place where a serious and elegant Grand Tourer is built. It begins to transform into a laboratory in which the limits of boldness can be explored without losing the essence of the brand. On a personal level, Ferruccio enjoys this stage with a mixture of satisfaction and renewed ambition. He sees his cars in the hands of clients who previously bought only Ferrari, hears positive comments from journalists who once knew his tractors and now analyze him as an automobile manufacturer, and clearly perceives that he has opened a door that nobody will be able to close again. However, far from stopping to celebrate, his character drives him to consider the next step, because he feels that the 350 GT has been an excellent entry into the world of luxury automobiles, but still has not defined an icon capable of leaving the industry breathless. Thus, while the 350 GT consolidates Lamborghini's reputation as a respectable and serious new player in the Grand Tourer market, the technical offices begin to sketch and discuss concepts that move away from the classical configuration. Dreams of cars that are lower, wider, with engines placed in unusual locations and lines that would seem to come from the future. Ideas that will soon materialize in a model destined to change forever the way the Italian supercar is understood. The Miura and the blow to the world. When the 350 GT is already moving with a certain naturalness along European roads, and the name Lamborghini begins to be spoken with respect among automobile enthusiasts, in the depths of the factory of Sant'Agata Bolognese something completely different is being created, a project that is born almost as an act of creative rebellion by a group of young engineers who feel that the elegant and refined Grand Tourer is very good, but that the brand has the potential to go further, to build a car that does not limit itself to competing with others, but that changes the rules of the game. That group is formed, among others, by Gianpaolo Dallara, Paolo Stanzani, and the test driver Bob Wallace, three men who live mechanics with the intensity of those who breathe, and who find in Lamborghini fertile ground to take their imagination to an extreme level. The idea that begins to circle in their minds is to create an automobile with a rear mid-engine, a configuration that at the time is seen almost exclusively in racing cars, single-seaters, and competition prototypes, but not in road-legal vehicles for private customers. Placing the engine in that position means completely changing the architecture of the car, the weight distribution, the dynamic behavior, and even the way of designing the bodywork, but it also offers a clear advantage: stability and agility in corners that no traditional front-engine Grand Tourer can match. It is a risky concept for a young brand that is still consolidating its image, and yet the boldness of these engineers and the ambition of the project end up finding a place in the vision of Ferruccio. Lamborghini, who at first shows caution towards such a radical proposal, ends up accepting the challenge partly because he recognizes the talent of the technical team, and partly because he has very present in his mind that the best way to accelerate the brand's reputation is to present something that leaves the world speechless. He allows them to move forward with the development of the chassis, almost as a parallel project, on the condition that they do not neglect daily work on the models already in production. Thus, an extraordinarily low and compact tubular frame is born, designed to house a 12-cylinder engine placed transversely behind the seats, a solution as ingenious as it is complex that requires extreme creativity in the distribution of mechanical elements and in the lubrication and transmission system. When the bare chassis is presented at the Turin Motor Show in the year 1965, without bodywork, without interior, only the tubular skeleton and the engine, the reaction of the specialized public is one of immediate astonishment. The attendees see before them a structure that seems taken from a racing car, something no one expects from such a young manufacturer, and speculation quickly begins about whether Lamborghini will be capable of bringing that concept to the street. What few know is that, in parallel, work is being done on a body capable of covering that technical base in a coherent way, a skin worthy of the audacity of the skeleton underneath. The design commission falls to Carrozzeria Bertone, and within that house the direct responsibility for the final shape will be a young Marcello Gandini, who faces the challenge of creating a silhouette that allows a huge engine in a mid-position without the car losing proportion, elegance, and functionality. The result of his work is a piece of design that will define an era. An extremely low coupe, with fluid lines, a short front hood, a forward cabin, and a wide and muscular rear section where the presence of the mechanical heart can be sensed. The proportions are so different from what is seen on the streets that the car looks more like a futuristic prototype than a vehicle prepared for real life. In the year 1966, when the complete car is presented at the Geneva Motor Show under the name Miura, in homage to a famous Spanish fighting bull ranch, the impact is so great that many visitors remain frozen in front of the Lamborghini stand for long minutes, trying to absorb what they are seeing. The low bodywork, the front headlights partially covered by metallic eyelashes, the air intakes, the aggressive yet harmonious proportions, everything contributes to the sensation of being in front of something that redefines the idea of a sports car. The press surrounds it. Photographers shoot non-stop, and conversations in the aisles of the show begin to revolve around a single point. The newcomer has eclipsed many veterans. The Miura is not only beautiful, it is also endowed with performance that, for the time, is overwhelming. Its 12-cylinder transverse engine, sharing a casing with the gearbox, is a very advanced piece of engineering, capable of delivering power that allows the car to surpass frightening speeds for those years, and its rear mid-engine configuration gives it road behavior very different from traditional front-engine Grand Tourers. Driving a Miura means going from feeling the weight of the engine in the front to perceiving it behind the back, which changes the way the car enters a curve, accelerates on exit, and transmits sensations through the steering wheel. Those who have the opportunity to test it are shocked by the combination of pure speed, mechanical sounds, and a sensation of lightness. The impact of the Miura transcends the technical realm and enters fully into the popular culture of the late 1960s. It begins to appear on the covers of lifestyle magazines, in reports about the new economic elite, in photographs where it is seen next to celebrities, actors, musicians, and businessmen who want to be seen beside that object that seems to condense in metal and glass the spirit of a decade that loves the extravagant, the new, and the bold. The car becomes a different kind of status symbol, because it does not only speak of purchasing power, it also communicates a certain inclination toward the risky, the disruptive, a way of understanding luxury more linked to personality than to protocol. For Lamborghini, the Miura represents a gigantic leap in terms of image. The 350 GT had convinced the experts, but the Miura leaves them breathless. The brand goes from being a respectable manufacturer of Grand Tourers to becoming the creator of what many consider the first super sports car of modern history, a car that combines racing techniques, radical design, and road use in a way that no one had managed to articulate with such impact in the market. The name of Sant'Agata Bolognese begins to be pronounced throughout the automotive world with a mixture of respect and fascination, and the bull on the emblem is consolidated as the symbol of a different way of understanding power. Ferruccio observes this wave of attention with a mixture of pride and caution. On one hand, he knows that the Miura has placed his brand at the top of the aspirational desire of thousands of motor enthusiasts. On the other hand, he is aware that such an extreme machine, so demanding to drive and so complex to manufacture, cannot be the sole foundation of a company that aspires to endure for many years. He understands that the Miura acts as a lighthouse, as a halo model that illuminates the entire range, giving identity and prestige. But he also learns from the experience that not all customers seek such a radical machine, and that it is necessary to balance that extreme image with products more usable in daily life. Inside the factory, the success of the Miura reinforces the morale of the engineers and designers, who see how their boldness has generated a wave of international admiration, and that feeds a creative climate in which they feel capable of proposing increasingly daring ideas. Conversations in the corridors stop revolving around whether Lamborghini will be able to compete with Ferrari, because that question seems resolved in terms of image, and they begin to focus on how to maintain that ability to surprise, to go one step ahead, to avoid becoming trapped in the repetition of a formula that, although brilliant, could become an anchor if exploited excessively. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the Miura demonstrates that a young company, if it dares to cross certain boundaries and surrounds itself with talent willing to take risks, can generate products that destroy hierarchies established over decades. Something that in the automotive world seems reserved for companies with a very long history. Lamborghini, with little time of existence, places itself in the conversation of the greats and forces everyone to rethink what it truly means to be a reference sports car manufacturer, a message that goes beyond engines and bodywork and enters the realm of mindset. With the Miura roaring along roads and filling the pages of automotive and lifestyle magazines, the decade of the 60s moves toward its final stretch, and the brand faces the challenge of capitalizing on that wave of fame, consolidating its own design language, a visual personality that makes anyone, upon seeing a car from Santa Gata, recognize it immediately, even before reading the emblem it carries on the front. The era of bold design. After the almost explosive impact of the Miura, the atmosphere inside Santa Gata Bolognese changes in a perceptible way. The nervousness of those who wonder whether the brand will survive is no longer present, and in its place, there is the creative electricity of a team that feels it has permission to go further, to experiment, and to turn each new model into a declaration of style, so that the decade of the late 1960s becomes, for Lamborghini, a permanent laboratory, where design stops being a mere accompaniment to mechanics and becomes a language of its own, recognizable and brave. In that context, the dialogue between Ferruccio, the engineers, and the designers becomes more intense than ever, because they all understand that the brand can no longer limit itself to surprising with a single iconic model, but must articulate a coherent range capable of seducing different types of clients without losing the irreverent essence that has placed it on the map. The connection with Carrozzeria Bertone and with Marcello Gandini becomes one of the keys of this stage, because that young designer, who has demonstrated his talent with the Miura, begins to explore more angular shapes, riskier proportions, and aesthetic solutions that moved away from the soft curves of the classic Grand Tourer, anticipating a trend that would dominate the 1970s, that of the low and wide car with almost geometric lines, as if it had been carved with a knife. While other brands keep looking backwards, inspired by the rounded shapes of the post-war period, Lamborghini opens a door toward the future and turns each body into a piece of rolling architecture, where every surface has intention and every edge seems to tell something about the personality of the car. In that scenario, the Espada emerges, presented in 1968, a model that breaks the expectations of those who thought Lamborghini would limit itself to radical two-seat coupes. The Espada is a Grand Tourer with 4 real seats, with a spacious cabin and a very particular fastback design that recalls certain experimental prototypes of the time, but which in this case materializes in a production car. Its low silhouette, with a roof extended toward the rear and an almost vertical rear glass hatch, gives it an unmistakable presence on the road. Ferruccio wants to show that a car with family capacity can preserve the defiant character of the brand, and that balance between functionality and aesthetic drama becomes one of the distinctive traits of the model. The interior of the Espada, with its abundant instrumentation, its usable rear seats, and an environment that mixes luxury with a certain futuristic air, reflects Lamborghini's intention to break away from the cliché of the uncomfortable sports car for capricious millionaires. offering a product that can be used daily by someone who wants to take his family or his business partners without renouncing the roar of a 12-cylinder engine under the hood. The message is clear. The boldness of the brand is not limited to making extreme cars. It also manifests itself in daring to reinterpret the concept of a practical grand tourer from a perspective radically different from that of traditional manufacturers. At the same time, Ferruccio understands that, although the Miura captures the headlines and the Espada opens a new category within the company, there are clients who seek something more discreet, more classic in its proportions, a car that, while maintaining the Lamborghini essence, offers a less extravagant language. For them, the Islero is born, presented that same year, 1968, a coupe with more sober lines, with a body designed by Carrozzeria Marazzi that takes elements from the 350 GT, but updated for the new stage of the brand. The Islero does not have the visual impact of the Miura, nor the extreme personality of the Espada, but it fulfills an important role. It demonstrates that Lamborghini is able to adapt to different sensibilities without diluting its character, maintaining the 12-cylinder engine as the common thread among its models. This coexistence of such different proposals within the same brand creates a kind of creative ecosystem in which each car fulfills a function in the global narrative of Lamborghini. The Miura symbolizes the break with the past, the supercar that seems to come from another planet. The Espada represents boldness applied to practicality, the attempt to combine family and mechanical brutality in a single object. The Islero, for its part, offers a more contained option for those who are attracted to the idea of driving a Lamborghini but do not want to draw attention in such an evident way. From a strategic perspective, this diversification is very interesting because it widens the range of clients without lowering the technical bar. Throughout these years, the factory of Sant'Agata becomes a constant parade of prototypes, updated versions, and small experiments that often do not reach the general public, but that serve as a testing ground for future solutions. Lamborghini begins to flirt with new configurations, with smaller displacement engines for specific markets, with designs that play with the idea of the triangle, the trapezoid, the wedge, and that will function as a prelude to the more extreme models that will arrive later. The concept of bold design is not an empty slogan placed in a marketing catalog. It is a daily reality in the design studios and in the technical conversations, where the recurring question is not, can we do it, but will it look different enough? Ferruccio himself, although he remains a pragmatic figure who looks at the accounts and worries about the economic viability of the business, allows himself to be seduced by this creative fever. He likes to arrive at the factory and see new shapes, models, sketches, to discuss with the designers, to sit in the prototypes, to feel how the world looks from the driver's seat of a car that does not yet exist for the public. Despite his rural origins and his practical mindset, he has developed a refined taste for aesthetics, a sensitivity that allows him to understand that in the segment where the brand moves, design is not an ornament. It is an essential part of the value perceived by the client, something that can justify a purchase decision as much as the technical specifications of the engine. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage shows one of the most interesting risks of rapid growth in creative sectors. When a company is validated by a resounding success, such as the Miura, it tends to trust deeply in its ability to continue surprising, and that confidence, which is positive for innovation, can lead it to play at the limit of its financial and organizational possibilities. Lamborghini lives on that edge during these years, investing in multiple projects, keeping several demanding models in production, betting on advanced technical solutions, and giving designers considerable freedom to explore risky paths. As long as the economy accompanies and the clients respond, the sensation is that of being on the crest of the wave. The market, for its part, observes the brand with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. The surname Lamborghini has become synonymous with automotive exoticism, with cars that are not seen on every corner, with shapes that look like showroom prototypes brought to the street. Specialized magazines dedicate entire pages to photographing the Espada from unusual angles, to analyzing the proportions of the Islero, to trying to explain the logic behind a manufacturer that, in less than a decade, has gone from nothing to dictating design trends. Wealthy clients who want to express their individuality in contrast with the sobriety of other brands find in Lamborghini a perfect tool to send that message to the world. However, on the horizon, clouds begin to appear that, although still distant, anticipate a change in the economic and energy climate that will fully affect the manufacturers of high-displacement cars. The world walks toward the decade of the 1970s with growing political tensions, profound social changes, and a relationship with petroleum that will soon become conflictive. In the middle of that approaching context, Lamborghini continues to bet on 12-cylinder engines, on increasingly striking designs, and on a rhythm of innovation that requires constant investments, without yet imagining to what extent those factors will be put to the test when external conditions stop being so favorable. Crisis and first turbulences. As Lamborghini moves into the early years of the decade of 1970, the sense of creative momentum and expansion that had dominated the second half of the 60s begins to merge with unsettling signals that, although at first they seem isolated, soon reveal a clear pattern. The global economic context is changing, consumer habits as well, and companies that depend on luxury products with enormous engines and high production costs find themselves in a vulnerable position. In that scenario, the brand founded by Ferruccio, which had managed in only a few years to place itself among the most audacious names in the world of the automobile, begins to notice that the wave that had lifted it upward also has a contrary force when the environment stops being favorable. In Italy, the social climate grows increasingly tense, with strikes, protests, rising inflation, and an agitated political atmosphere that directly affects the industry. Factories suffer constant interruptions and productivity weakens, while the cost of energy rises and raw materials become more expensive. The economic model that had allowed the rapid expansion of sectors such as the automotive industry begins to falter, and companies like Lamborghini, which produce extremely sophisticated machines in small volumes, feel that impact with particular intensity. Ferruccio, accustomed to working in difficult contexts since the post-war era, tries to remain calm, but he realizes that this time, the difficulties do not depend solely on internal decisions, but on external forces that are difficult to control. The Espada, the Miura, and the other models in the catalog continue to attract attention, but the sales figures show an irregular behavior because the international market for luxury automobiles experiences changes in purchasing patterns. Clients begin to examine their expenses more closely, and the maintenance of vehicles so advanced and temperamental is perceived as a commitment that some are no longer willing to assume. Wealthy customers still exist, but their priorities shift, and in that shift, Lamborghini faces the challenge of sustaining a complex business structure with a less stable flow of income than it had imagined when the euphoria of the Miura was at its highest point. Meanwhile, on the international stage, political tensions begin to emerge around the control of oil, tensions that will explode with unexpected force during the oil crisis of 1973. Although in the early years of the decade, the major blow has not yet occurred, the signs are already present. Fuel prices rise, some countries experience restrictions, and manufacturers know that large displacement engines could become a burden if the situation worsens. For Lamborghini, whose cars depend on 12-cylinder power units that consume significant amounts of fuel, this perspective is especially worrying and forces reflection about the sustainability of the business model in the immediate future. In parallel with these external factors, the internal structure of the company also begins to show strain. The rapid expansion of the previous years, with multiple projects underway and a constant pace of innovation, had required considerable investments and a complex financial management. Ferruccio, who had always been a pragmatic entrepreneur, begins to feel increasingly pressured by the demands of keeping the factory running, financing the development of new models, attending to technical updates, and responding to a market that is becoming uncertain. The challenge is not only to sell cars, but to balance a costly industrial ecosystem at a moment in which every decision can tip the scale toward stability or toward risk. On a personal level, Ferruccio finds himself in a stage of life in which his relationship with the company becomes more introspective. He has spent decades working tirelessly, rising from the times when he dismantled military machinery and roads to the present, where he leads one of the most admired brands in the world of motorsport. However, creating a prestigious automobile brand has proved far more exhausting than he imagined, because the margin for error is minimal and competitiveness is brutal. Unlike his tractor and heating businesses, which, although demanding, move in more stable sectors, the world of supercars depends on extremely sensitive factors: prestige, image, economic context, fashion, investment in technology, and, above all, an emotional capital that must be continuously fed. This mixture of internal pressure and external threat becomes more evident when the market begins to demand quick responses. Sales of the Miura hold steady, but no longer grow. The Espada finds its audience, but does not generate enough flow to sustain the entire structure. Future projects require investment and time, and the Italian economy, far from stabilizing, enters one of the most turbulent periods in its recent history. In this context, Ferruccio makes decisions that reveal his usual pragmatism. He reduces costs, analyzes possible alliances, searches for ways to maintain activity without compromising the essence of the brand. However, reality ends up imposing itself with painful clarity. The company needs a boost that he, by himself, can no longer guarantee. In 1972, a decision marks the beginning of a new stage in the founder's life. Ferruccio sells the majority of his share in Lamborghini Trattori, pressured by financial difficulties derived from a poor harvest and the non-payment of orders by international governments, a blow that directly affects his personal liquidity. The sale of his most stable company, both emotionally and economically, represents a deep wound, because the tractors had symbolized the beginning of everything, the foundation upon which he had built his entrepreneurial identity and his economic independence. Now, that fundamental piece slips from his hands to sustain another company that, although brilliant in creativity, requires resources that evaporate rapidly. Shortly afterward, he decides to sell 51% of Automobili Lamborghini to a Swiss group led by Georges Henri Rossetti. The negotiation is complex, filled with conflicting emotions, because Ferruccio feels that he is surrendering part of his creation, but at the same time understands that it is the only way to give the brand the opportunity to survive in an increasingly hostile environment. He keeps a minority share and remains linked to management for a few more months, but his emotional involvement begins to diminish, as if he were accepting that the time has come to release control of a project to which he dedicated his pride, his energy, and a vast portion of his life. In 1974, after reflecting about his future and observing from a distance how the market evolves, he makes a final decision. He definitively leaves the company he founded, retires to his estate La Fiorita near Lake Trasimeno, and dedicates himself to agriculture, producing wine, and managing a lifestyle that allows him to breathe without the constant weight of the automotive industry on his shoulders. The man who had created one of the most challenging brands in the history of motorsport decides to return to the land, to a slower rhythm, to an environment that reminds him of his origins and allows him to reconnect with a type of work less spectacular but much more stable. His departure leaves Lamborghini at a delicate crossroads. The brand has gained prestige, it has iconic models, but it faces a difficult market, a brutal energy crisis, and the need to reinvent itself without its founder. The factory of Sant'Agata must navigate with new owners, new strategies, and new uncertainties at a moment in which the future of the high-displacement sports car seems threatened by global factors impossible to ignore. And so, while Ferruccio distances himself from the noise of the engines to seek a quieter existence, the company that bears his surname enters a stage marked by difficult decisions, changes in leadership, and the constant struggle to remain alive in an environment that no longer resembles the one in which it was born. The myth without its creator. When Ferruccio Lamborghini retires permanently to his estate and decides to leave the world of automobiles behind, the Sant'Agata Bolognese factory awakens to a new, strange, and almost uncomfortable reality, because the man who had given the project its name, its character, and its direction no longer walks through the hallways, no longer raises his voice in meetings, no longer pauses to listen to the sound of an idling engine to decide whether something is right or wrong. The company continues to exist. The workshops remain full of tools, and the automobiles continue to leave through the factory doors. But something essential has changed. The myth begins to move forward without its creator, like a creature that has lost its father and must learn to stand supported by other hands, by other criteria, and by other priorities. After Ferruccio's departure, the majority control falls into the hands of the Swiss investors led by Georges-Henri Rossetti, accompanied by René Leimer, who approach the company with a vision that is more financial than emotional, concerned with balancing accounts, controlling expenses, and finding formulas that allow a luxury automobile manufacturer to remain viable in the midst of a crisis climate. They are men of numbers, of balance sheets, of investment strategies, And although they respect the value of the Lamborghini name and understand the importance of maintaining an image of exclusivity and boldness, they do not feel the project as an extension of themselves, something that inevitably shows in the tone of the decisions that are made. The visionary spirit of the founder gives way to a management style that tries to survive among debts, rising costs, and a shaken market. The oil crisis of 1973 arrives like a hammer blow to a sector that was already in a fragile position. But for Lamborghini, it has an especially harsh effect, because its catalog is based on large displacement engines, depending on a fuel that suddenly becomes a symbol of political and economic trouble. Governments asking for moderation in consumption, messages associating powerful automobiles with wastefulness, restrictions, queues at gas stations. The social climate becomes hostile toward everything the brand represents. Supercars stop being simply objects of desire and become, in the minds of many, a kind of provocation in complicated times, and that drastically reduces the number of clients willing to cross that line. Inside the factory, the workers live those years with a mixture of resistant pride and daily worry. They continue building automobiles that the world admires in magazines and posters, but it becomes increasingly evident that the flow of orders is not enough to guarantee long-term stability. Many employees had joined Sant'Agata when Ferruccio still walked among them, and they remember his direct character, his ability to motivate, and his way of solving problems with a combination of instinct and authority. Now, the management feels more distant, colder, focused on restructurings, adjustments, and cuts. The Lamborghini myth continues to grow outward, in the imagination of the public, while internally, the company struggles to breathe. In those unstable years, the catalog shrinks and reconfigures itself. The Miura, which had defined an era, is no longer produced. The Espada and other models maintain a limited presence, and little by little, the Countach, presented at the beginning of the decade as a radical prototype and put into production in the mid-1970s, begins to occupy the place of the brand's absolute standard-bearer. However, developing and producing such an extreme automobile in an adverse economic context is like trying to keep a bonfire lit in the middle of a storm. It requires constant effort, financial creativity, and an almost irrational faith that the future will justify that sacrifice. The Swiss investors find themselves trapped between the desire to preserve the Lamborghini aura and the harshness of balance sheets that do not forgive mistakes. At a global level, regulations regarding emissions, safety, and homologation become increasingly strict, especially in key markets such as the United States, which means that every automobile destined for that country requires specific, costly, and complicated adaptations. For a small manufacturer without the backing of a large industrial group, meeting those requirements becomes a gigantic challenge, and more than once the question arises whether it is worth continuing to try to access certain markets, or if it would be better to concentrate on smaller and closer niches. That tension between the dream of being a truly global brand and the reality of its limited resources shapes many of the decisions of these years. In 1978, the financial situation explodes in all its harshness, and Automobili Lamborghini enters a process of controlled administration, a kind of legal limbo in which an attempt is made to avoid definitive disappearance, while solutions, buyers, agreements with creditors, and any formula capable of keeping the machinery running are sought. The outward image continues to be that of an exotic brand creating colossal machines, but in the offices and on the production lines the atmosphere is very different. Uncertainty, pauses, waits, low-voiced conversations about the future of employment, about whether the bull will continue charging or collapse to the ground from exhaustion. And even so, in the midst of this storm, there is something that does not go out: Lamborghini's ability to feed the collective imagination. Although the sales figures are modest, the brand's automobiles appear on magazine covers, posters in the rooms of teenagers, movie scenes, and motor magazine reports all around the world. The Countach, with its sharp wedge-shaped silhouette, its vertically opening doors, and its spaceship-like appearance, becomes the perfect symbol of an era that dreams of extreme speed, futuristic lines, and aesthetic rebellion. The fact that the company producing it is in trouble does not matter in the eyes of the public, because what remains imprinted in memory is the shape, the roar of the engine, the sensation that this automobile belongs to an almost unreal world. That contrast between the external brilliance of the myth and the internal fragility of the business structure offers a powerful lesson for anyone interested in entrepreneurship. The brand, understood as a set of meanings, memories, and desires, can fly very high even when the company that sustains it walks along the edge of the abyss. Lamborghini becomes a clear example of how a strong identity, built with extraordinary products, resists through crises and remains in the collective imagination even when the numbers do not support it, creating a kind of intangible capital that will eventually attract new saviors. At the beginning of the decade of 1980, after years of uncertainty and administration, the Mimran family appears on the scene. Swiss entrepreneurs led by Patrick and Jean-Claude Mimran, who decide to invest in Lamborghini and take control of the company. They see in the brand something that continues to have value despite its financial problems, a name recognized throughout the world, a catalog with legendary models, and a technical and human foundation in Sant'Agata that, with the appropriate investment, could once again operate in a more stable way. Under their leadership, modernization processes begin, production is reorganized, installations are updated, and work begins with a certain long-term vision, no longer solely with the objective of surviving quarter by quarter. The Mimran stage will still be full of challenges, experiments, and imperfect decisions, but it represents a clear change from the drift of previous years, because it places Lamborghini once again on a path of conscious reconstruction, with the goal of consolidating existing models, launching some new ones, and preparing the company for a possible leap into the hands of a larger industrial group. Meanwhile, the myth continues to grow outward, fueled by the iconic power of the Countach and the fascination it provokes in an entire generation of young people who begin to associate the word Lamborghini with the ultimate symbol of excess, speed, and extreme design. In those years, the founder lives far removed from all this movement, dedicated to his vineyards and to a quieter life, while the surname he carries appears on covers, advertisements, and posters that he sees from a distance. Like someone watching a child who has taken his own path, with problems and triumphs in which he no longer intervenes, the company, without his figure at the helm, navigates all these turbulences, supported by something he left as an invisible inheritance. The conviction that automobiles must make one feel something, must be more than a means of transport, must embody a character. That essence, mixed with the perseverance of those who refuse to watch the bull die, will be what allows Lamborghini to continue moving forward until it eventually finds a definitive home under the umbrella of a giant in the industry. The resurrection of the Countach. When the Mimran family takes the reins of Lamborghini at the beginning of the decade of 1980, the company carries years of instability, interruptions in production, and a moral exhaustion that would have sunk any manufacturer without such a strong identity. However, within Sant'Agata Bolognese there still beats a flame that refuses to go out, fueled by the memory of the Miura, by the boldness that had defined the early years, and, above all, by the presence of a model that had already become the ultimate symbol of the brand, the Countach. That car, born as a prototype at the beginning of the 70s and put into production shortly after, was not merely a product. It was a visual and sonic manifesto of what it meant to be Lamborghini, an object that seemed too extreme to survive a crisis, but that ultimately became the piece that kept the brand's image alive in its most uncertain moments. The Countach had been conceived by Marcello Gandini following the idea of a futuristic wedge, a line that broke with every previous reference and carried the concept of the supercar into a completely different territory. Its vertical opening doors, which would become part of Lamborghini's identity, its tense proportions, and its sharp surfaces, made it look like a machine escaped from a technological fantasy. However, its production had suffered ups and downs due to the company's financial difficulties, labor interruptions, and the inability to sustain a steady manufacturing rhythm. When the Mimran family arrives, they find a car that continues to generate fascination throughout the world, but whose continuity depends on a profound reorganization. The first step consists of stabilizing the production line, improving assembly quality, and updating certain components that had been left behind during the turbulent years. The Countach was an extraordinary car, but also a demanding one. Its longitudinal 12-cylinder engine, its peculiar driving position, and its extreme behavior made it difficult for just anyone to tame it, and to keep it relevant in a market that advanced at increasing speed. It was necessary to update it with discernment. The engineers of Sant'Agata, many of whom had participated in earlier phases of the model, find themselves with an opportunity to return to the Countach, the solidity it had always deserved. Refining parts, improving transmissions, introducing more efficient cooling systems, and reviewing structural details to guarantee a car that was more robust and more consistent in its assembly. The updates are not limited to the technical aspect. The design also evolves, maintaining the wedge essence that defined the model, but incorporating aerodynamic elements, more pronounced wheel arches, renewed air intakes, and, in some versions, a rear spoiler that becomes one of the most identifiable visual symbols of the decade. While other manufacturers soften their lines or seek a more rational language, Lamborghini continues to bet on a radical, almost aggressive aesthetic that transforms the Countach into a cultural icon both on and off the road. Automotive magazines, posters in young people's bedrooms, music videos, films. The car slips into all those spaces as a figure symbolizing the extreme form of automotive desire. In terms of driving, the Countach is an intense experience, harsh at times, but incomparable for those who seek pure sensations. Its narrow cabin, its reduced visibility, and the need to lean partially out of the car to maneuver in reverse become anecdotes that feed its legend. Those who drive it are not searching for absolute comfort. They seek a different experience, a direct connection with a machine that demands commitment and skill. That lack of concessions is precisely what reinforces Lamborghini's identity in those years, because the Countach demonstrates that even when the global market seems to be moving toward more domesticated formulas, the brand keeps alive a philosophy of intensity and spectacle. As the world changes, Lamborghini uses the decade of the 80s to consolidate variants of the Countach that reflect accumulated improvements over time. Versions such as the LP4000 and the LP500 appear, each with adjustments in engine, chassis, brakes, and design. Some incorporate renewed carburetors, and others introduce injection systems that respond to new regulations and to the need to offer a more precise response. The factory also modernizes internal processes, incorporating technologies that had been out of reach during the crisis years and that now allow more consistent manufacturing. The presence of the Miura family becomes a sort of bridge between the emotional heritage of the founder and the industrial future of the brand. They do not have the same visceral relationship with mechanics that Ferruccio had, but they understand the intangible value of the Lamborghini name, and that leads them to invest in infrastructure, in development, and in a technical team capable of preparing the company for an eventual sale to a larger group. Their objective is to stabilize the business so it can be integrated into a corporate structure with greater financial strength, and in that transition the Countach serves as the perfect business card, a clear demonstration that Lamborghini remains relevant, remains desired, and still has something to offer the supercar market. As the decade advances, the public perception of the Countach transforms. It ceases to be simply a car and becomes a symbol of an era. The 80s, with its luminous aesthetic, its culture of excess, and its fascination with the futuristic, adopt it as one of its representative objects. The wedge silhouette appears on shirts, on music album covers, on advertisements, on murals, and practically any medium that wants to convey modernity and boldness. That Lamborghini continues to exist as a company, despite the difficulties of the 70s, is due in great part to the way in which this model keeps the brand's relevance alive during a period in which its internal stability is far from guaranteed. Within Sant'Agata, the Countach also exerts a motivating effect on the workers. Each car that leaves the line is a symbolic victory, proof that the company remains standing. Many employees who lived through the hardest years find in the continuity of the model a source of pride because it reminds them that, despite having endured judicial administrations and changes of ownership, they are still capable of building one of the most admired machines in the world. That sense of belonging, reinforced by the emotional bond with the model, acts as glue in a stage in which the brand needs internal cohesion to prepare for its next chapter. The resurrection of the Countach during the 80s is not only an automotive chapter, but an example of business resilience. The brand lives a stage in which the strength of a single product keeps alive the reputation of an entire manufacturer, demonstrating that when a company builds something truly iconic, that product can become a lifeline capable of sustaining identities, attracting investors, and ensuring continuity even in times of great uncertainty. The story of Lamborghini in those years is almost a study in how a well-managed icon can keep the flame burning while a more robust corporate structure is sought. While the Countach continues roaring on roads around the world and consolidates itself as the supercar that defines a decade, Lamborghini approaches a new change of direction, one that will bring the brand into the hands of an international company that will transform its future in a way that Ferruccio could never have imagined. The international rescue. When the echo of the Countach still resonates powerfully in popular culture, and the Miura family has managed, at least in appearance, to stabilize production and restore a certain normality to the factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese, an idea emerges that begins as a distant possibility and ends up becoming the decisive maneuver for the future of the brand. The entry of a major international group capable of providing something that had always been missing in Lamborghini: a deep financial foundation and a robust industrial structure able to sustain the overflowing creativity that characterized the House of the Bull. The Miura era had been, in essence, a transitional phase, a bridge stretched between the fragility that followed the crisis of the 1970s and the possibility of integrating into a business universe of far greater scale. That bridge finds its other end in 1987, when Chrysler Corporation, one of the giants of the automotive world from the United States, decides to acquire Automobili Lamborghini. For many, the news sounds almost surreal. A profoundly Italian brand, associated with aesthetic excess and extreme mechanics, passes into the hands of a North American corporation that operates in segments of high volume, with sedans and family vehicles designed for mass audiences. However, from the perspective of Chrysler, the operation carries strategic logic, because it offers them a symbol of European prestige, a laboratory of image and technology that can improve the global perception of the group. For Lamborghini, in contrast, the purchase means fresh air, resources, access to broader networks of suppliers, and the promise of a stability they had not known in decades. With the arrival of Chrysler, the factory in Sant'Agata goes through an intense period of modernization. Production processes are updated, quality standards are reviewed, new tools are introduced for assembly control, and certain administrative areas that previously depended on more improvised structures become more professionalized. The North Americans send executives, auditors, specialists in industrial processes, people who view the brand with the eyes of efficiency, concerned with profitability, deadlines, and the coherence of the product range. The cultural contrast is evident. On one side, engineers and Italian workers accustomed to prioritizing the passion and character of each car. On the other, executives who understand the automobile as part of a global business system where numbers rule. In that clash of mentalities, one of the most important projects of this era develops, the successor to the Countach. Lamborghini had spent years forming the idea of a new super sports car capable of inheriting the throne of the model that had defined the image of the brand for more than a decade, and under the influence of Chrysler, that project takes definitive shape in what would eventually be called Diablo. Development of the car had begun even before the purchase, but the injection of resources and the management structure of the North American corporation allow the process to accelerate, improve the engineering, and organize testing more effectively. The objective is clear: to create an automobile that recovers the extreme essence of the Countach, but with a level of refinement, power, and stability more consistent with the approaching 1990s. The Diablo, which is presented in early 1990, incorporates a new generation 12-cylinder engine, a more carefully studied aerodynamics package, and an interior that, although still radical, attempts to offer a level of ergonomics and quality superior to that of its predecessor. Its maximum speed, above 300 kilometers per hour, places it among the fastest cars in the world, and its design, although less sharp than that of the Countach, maintains an intimidating presence, with generous air intakes, muscular lines, and a stance that makes it clear it was not created to go unnoticed. For Chrysler, the Diablo becomes a technological and image showcase, a way of saying, we are present in the most extreme segment of the sports automobile, but the North American era does not revolve solely around that model. During those years, the brand still coexists with the legacy of the LM002, that off-road vehicle with a military appearance that had begun as a project with an almost warlike vocation and ended up becoming an extravagant civilian vehicle with a 12-cylinder engine and an appearance so colossal that it seemed like a caricature of opulence. The LM002 finds its small audience among oil magnates, high-ranking military personnel and clients who seek an object of unprecedented ostentation. Although its production figures are limited, it contributes to maintaining the media conversation around Lamborghini as a creator of machines that defy any conventional logic. However, despite the progress, coexistence between the industrial logic of Chrysler and the capricious nature of the supersports car segment is not simple. The development and production costs of cars like the Diablo are enormous. Sales volumes remain reduced, and Lamborghini's contribution to the group's global results is more symbolic than economic. The North American corporation also faces its own internal challenges, with ups and downs in its main business, and the idea of maintaining such a demanding brand in its portfolio begins to be questioned in the highest spheres. Lamborghini is a jewel, yes, but an expensive jewel to maintain, one that requires constant investment and does not fully fit a strategy centered on high-volume products. As the decade of the 1990s advances, Chrysler's attention turns toward its own problems, and the initial enthusiasm for the Italian adventure loses intensity. In 1994, they decide to sell Lamborghini to a consortium led by the Indonesian company Megatech, which acquires the brand through a complex structure of enterprises, together with other automotive assets. This step opens a peculiar era in the history of Lamborghini, marked by the sensation of being in the hands of owners who are geographically distant, with diverse interests and a vision of the business less clear than that of previous proprietors. Sant'Agata, once again, must adapt to other bosses, other corporate cultures, other ways of understanding the value of the brand. The Megatech era is characterized by a mixture of continuity and confusion. The Diablo remains the pillar of the product line and receives updates to remain competitive against rivals that appear from other parts of the world. But investment in new projects is irregular. Resources do not flow with the steadiness that would be necessary, and strategic decisions seem, at times, more reactive than planned. In spite of this, the Italian engineers continue working with the same pride as always, refining versions, improving mechanical aspects, introducing variants with all-wheel drive or aesthetic revisions that maintain the interest of the most loyal clients. During these years, Lamborghini is perceived from the outside as a glorious brand trapped in a kind of corporate limbo, respected for its history and desired for its main product, but without the structural support necessary to calmly plan the future. Enthusiasts keep dreaming of the Diablo and remember the Countach as a myth. Collectors continue seeking earlier models, and the brand preserves its capacity to generate pure emotion, even though it continues suffering from the instability it has dragged along since the 1970s, now under a new disguise. From the perspective of the world of entrepreneurship, this stage of international rescue offers a very revealing nuance. A brand can pass from one hand to another, be managed by Swiss owners, North Americans, Indonesians, or whoever comes next, but its real value does not reside so much in the immediate financial result as in that invisible thread that connects it with the imagination of the public, in that emotional capital that was built by Ferruccio and his teams through bold decisions and unforgettable products. Lamborghini remains attractive as an asset precisely because its name continues to evoke intense emotions, regardless of the financial turbulence surrounding it. As the 1990s move forward, the global automotive sector begins to concentrate into large industrial groups that gather several brands under a single umbrella, sharing technologies, platforms, and resources. In that playing field, Lamborghini emerges as a piece that could fit magnificently into the hands of a European manufacturer with a vocation for prestige and a particular interest in strengthening its sports image. That possibility, which still seems diffuse, will soon become the definitive turn that will allow the bull of Sant'Agata to leave behind decades of instability and find, at last, a stable home from which to project its character into the 21st century. The rebirth with Audi. When the decade of 1990 enters its final stretch, Lamborghini remains a desired brand, admired and surrounded by an almost mythical aura, but inside it continues dragging structural wounds, with a recent history marked by changes of ownership, limited resources, and an excessive dependence on models that, although iconic, have already squeezed almost all of their potential. It is in that context, at once fragile and promising, that a new actor appears on the scene who will completely change the course of the company. The Volkswagen Group, through Audi, decides to acquire Lamborghini in 1998, with the intention of turning it into the extreme sports jewel of its constellation of brands. For Sant'Agata Bolognese, this operation marks the beginning of a radically different stage, in which Italian talent combines with German engineering and discipline to shape a profound rebirth. Audi sees something very clear in Lamborghini: a powerful identity, a fascinating history, and an immense technical legacy that, however, have been managed for years from business structures that were far too weak. What is missing is not charisma, but stability. The strategy of the German group consists of injecting capital, modernizing facilities, introducing more rigorous working methods, and at the same time preserving the rebellious spirit that has turned the bull into a symbol of controlled excess. It is not about taming Lamborghini until turning it into a conventional brand, but rather giving it a solid skeleton so it can continue behaving like a beast on wheels without collapsing financially every so often. The impact of the acquisition is felt very soon in the factory. The production processes are reviewed with a magnifying glass. Quality control systems inspired by Audi's standards are introduced. Investment is made in new machinery, and workflows are reorganized to reduce errors, idle time, and unnecessary costs. The workers of Sant'Agata, accustomed to dealing with improvisation and to bringing cars to life almost in an artisanal way during difficult periods, begin to coexist with German production engineers who arrive with charts, metrics, and methodologies that at first generate some resistance, but that gradually prove their usefulness. The combination of Italian creative passion and German systematicity begins to yield tangible results in the form of better finished cars, more reliable vehicles, and machines that are easier to maintain, without sacrificing the wild character that makes Lamborghini special. In parallel with this industrial modernization, work is underway on the successor to the Diablo, a model that has carried the brand's image for years and needs a replacement worthy of a new era. The result of that process is the Murcielago, presented in 2001, the first Lamborghini developed entirely under the umbrella of Audi. The car retains a naturally aspirated 12-cylinder engine, faithful to the house's tradition, but integrates it into a much more refined architecture. With all-wheel drive, a reinforced structure, and a level of dynamic refinement that makes it clear that the engineering of the German group has provided a new level of precision. The design, the work of Luc Donkerwolke, respects the extreme wedge language inherited from the Countach and the Diablo, but interprets it with cleaner surfaces, tense lines, and proportions that convey a sense of aggressive modernity. The Murcielago becomes the brand's new standard-bearer, a sort of declaration of intent telling the world that the bull has returned with renewed strength. The combination of brutal performance, improved finish, and a sharp image grants it an enthusiastic reception among the press and customers. More than a simple successor, this model embodies the bridge between the romantic Lamborghini, almost chaotic in its processes, and the Lamborghini of the 21st century, capable of competing on equal terms with other supercar manufacturers in perceived quality, reliability, and user experience. The roar of the 12-cylinder engine remains visceral, but now it is accompanied by the sensation that the car has been conceived within a modern industrial structure, without losing its soul. The next strategic move of the new Lamborghini under Audi proves fundamental for the company's health: the creation of a second, smaller model with a 10-cylinder engine and an approach that, without ceasing to be extreme, broadens the range of potential customers. Thus, the Gallardo is born, presented in 2003, a car that relies to a large extent on technical synergy with Audi, and that over time becomes the best-selling model in the brand's history up to that moment. The Gallardo offers a more accessible proposal within the Lamborghini universe, with more contained dimensions, a driving experience that is somewhat easier to manage, and a relatively less unattainable price compared to the 12-cylinder models, opening the door to many buyers who previously observed the bull from a distance. The success of the Gallardo has a decisive structural impact. For the first time, Lamborghini has a model that generates constant and significant production volumes, enabling the company to stabilize income, plan further ahead, invest in development, and maintain a more comfortable workforce. The factory experiences a phase in which workstations are continuously occupied, suppliers receive regular orders, and the name of Sant'Agata becomes associated with a steady flow of supercars leaving towards dealerships around the world. the company definitively leaves behind the pattern of spectacular rises and dramatic falls, entering a healthier cycle in which the curves no longer resemble an electrocardiogram on the verge of collapse. At the same time, the brand's visual identity is consolidated as its own language, recognizable at a glance. The sharp angles, the flat surfaces, the aggressive air intakes, the almost triangular proportions when viewed from above, all of this becomes a code that anyone, even without being a motor expert, identifies as something very Lamborghini. The design center works hand in hand with the engineers, not only to create beautiful cars, but to ensure that each line has an aerodynamic or functional purpose. Advanced materials such as carbon fiber are incorporated into more structural and body components, allowing the combination of rigidity, lightness, and safety in a much more efficient way than in previous decades. Under Audi's umbrella, Lamborghini also enters fully into a new technological era. Electronic engine management systems, more sophisticated traction and stability controls, high-performance brakes with composite materials, automated gearboxes, and later on, dual-clutch transmissions that transform the way power is delivered to the asphalt. The challenge consists in integrating all this technology without turning the car into something cold or devoid of sensations. And in that pursuit, the brand finds a delicate balance, maintaining the brutality of the thrust, the unmistakable sound, and the incendiary aesthetics, while the driver benefits from a layer of electronic assistance that allows them to explore the limits with a bit more margin. On the business side, integration into the Volkswagen Group grants Lamborghini something it had always lacked: a global support network, access to shared technological platforms, the ability to negotiate with suppliers from a position of strength, and sufficient financial backing to invest in long-term projects without being dependent on each cyclical crisis. The brand maintains its production in Sant'Agata, its own design team, and its philosophy of manufacturing cars in relatively limited numbers, but now it does so with the security of knowing that it forms part of a conglomerate that does not depend on the results of a single model to survive. The Murcielago and Gallardo era lays the foundations for what will come next. A new generation of models that will raise the bar in power, design, and technology. From the Aventador to the Huracan, including special series and limited production hybrids that aim to anticipate the future without losing the connection to a past dominated by naturally aspirated engines. The rebirth with Audi does not simply rescue Lamborghini from its ups and downs, it transforms it into a brand prepared to play a leading role in the universe of 21st-century hypercars, with a mixture of mechanical tradition and innovation that will continue evolving in the following years, as the automotive world enters the era of electrification and environmental challenges. The legacy of the Untamable Bull. When Lamborghini fully enters the 21st century, already integrated into the solid structure of the Volkswagen Group and supported directly by Audi, the brand finds itself facing a scenario that would have been difficult to imagine for that young Ferruccio who dismantled engines in rural Italy in 1930. The high-performance automobile market is now global. The screens of the world display supercars as if they were movie stars. Social networks amplify every launch, and technology advances at a pace that threatens to make any solution obsolete within a few years. So the true challenge is no longer to build a spectacular car, but to maintain a clear identity while the ground beneath one's feet constantly shifts. And yet, in the midst of all that movement, Lamborghini achieves something very difficult to accomplish. Continuing to be recognized as the symbol of controlled excess, of radical design, and of power pushed to the limit, without losing the thread that connects it to its origins. The Aventador, presented in 2011, perfectly reflects that balance between tradition and future, because it takes the idea of the great naturally aspirated 12-cylinder engine, that mechanical heart that has defined the brand for decades, and wraps it in a carbon fiber monocoque chassis, in a body of sharp lines that resembles a faceted sculpture, and in an electronic architecture that controls every movement of the machine with a precision impossible in past times. The car becomes the new standard-bearer of the house, the heir to the Miura, the Countach, the Diablo, and the Murcielago, but it does so from a much more mature platform, with a development process that integrates exhaustive tests, advanced simulations, and an obsession with ensuring that every unit leaving Sant'Agata combines the visceral roar of the engine with a level of reliability consistent with the standards of a modern industrial group. The Aventador is the demonstration that the Bull can continue charging with the same force as always, but now with a better forged armor. In parallel, the Huracan, presented in 2014, picks up the baton from the Gallardo and confirms that the decision to bet on a smaller model with a 10-cylinder engine and a more daily philosophy has been one of the most intelligent choices in the brand's recent history. The Huracan preserves the drama of the shapes, the aggressiveness of the air intakes, and the unmistakable character of Lamborghini, but it shows itself to be somewhat more accessible in its driving, with electronic aids that allow more drivers to approach its limits without being overwhelmed. From a business perspective, this model becomes the true pillar of volume, the car that guarantees a constant flow of sales, and that brings the Bull closer to customers who, in another era, might have looked toward Ferrari, Porsche, or McLaren, now tilting the balance toward Sant'Agata thanks to a mixture of design, sound, and brand experience that proves extremely seductive. The great strategic move that breaks the expectations of many arrives with the appearance of the Urus, the high-performance sport utility vehicle that Lamborghini officially launches at the end of the decade of 2010, reopening in a different way that door that had been left ajar in the 1980s with the LM002. The world has changed. High-income customers are no longer content with having a supercar for weekends and a comfortable sedan for daily use. Now they seek vehicles that combine space, height, family practicality, and performance that a few years ago would have been unthinkable in a car of this type. In that context, the Urus appears as a response that many purists initially view with suspicion, but that soon demonstrates an overwhelming commercial effectiveness. With a turbocharged 8-cylinder engine, a luxurious interior, and a powerful silhouette, the model becomes the key that opens for Lamborghini, the doors of a segment in which sales volumes multiply what could be achieved with traditional sports cars, generating resources that are later reinvested in the development of new technologies and in the preservation of the brand's most radical legacy. At the same time, the automotive world is pushed toward a profound transformation by environmental concerns, emissions regulations, and advances in electrification, which forces Lamborghini to ask itself how to transfer its essence to an era in which pure combustion engines seem to be living their final chapters as absolute protagonists. The initial answer arrives in the form of limited production models, like the Sian, which incorporates a hybrid system based on supercapacitors and combines a naturally aspirated 12-cylinder engine with electric assistance, thus exploring the possibility of adding technology without renouncing the sound or the power delivery that have historically defined the brand. These projects, more experimental, serve as laboratories of ideas, as rolling prototypes that point the way toward a range in which electrification will no longer be a curiosity but will become a structural part of the catalog. In the midst of all this technological evolution, Lamborghini continues to understand that its true product is not only a car, but an experience that begins long before turning the key or pressing the start button, a narrative that starts when someone sees for the first time the silhouette of a new model on a screen or on the street, and feels that they are facing something that does not resemble anything ordinary. The brand carefully shapes the sound of the engine, the proportions of the body, the way the doors open, the sensation of sitting very close to the ground and seeing the world through a low and wide windshield. Every detail is made to reinforce the idea that driving a Lamborghini is entering a different state, a kind of personal ceremony where time compresses with every acceleration. If one looks at this entire story from the perspective of entrepreneurship, the legacy of the Untamable Bull goes far beyond specific models and sales figures. It speaks of the ability of one person, Ferruccio Lamborghini, to transform a momentary humiliation into a gigantic strategic decision, to take the knowledge acquired in contexts as harsh as war and the agricultural post-war period and elevate it to the level of luxury products that travel the entire world. It also speaks of the fragility of companies that depend on favorable economic contexts and of the importance of building financial and organizational structures capable of withstanding crises. For decades, Lamborghini was an example of overflowing talent sustained on unstable foundations, and its survival is due to a mixture of stubbornness, very well-crafted icons, and the ability to attract new saviors when everything seemed to be collapsing. In the current stage, The legacy is expressed in that mixture of fidelity to the original spirit and adaptation to the times. Because the brand has understood that the road to the future requires integrating electrification, connectivity, and sustainability without making concessions in what makes it unique. The challenge consists of designing cars that may have fewer cylinders, or that combine electric and combustion engines, but that continue producing the same instinctive reaction when someone sees them or hears them up close. That mixture of admiration and respect that the bull of the shield has always wanted to inspire. If that essence survives, Ferruccio's legacy will remain alive, even if fuels, batteries, or regulations completely change the landscape. And, in the end, when one travels through the entire history of Lamborghini, from that child fascinated by machines in 1916 to the hybrid hypercars of the 21st century, what remains is the sensation that the true legacy of the untamable bull is not a specific model nor a power figure, but an attitude toward the limit, a way of looking at mechanics and design as tools to challenge the established, which continues to resonate in every generation that dares to face a saturated market without renouncing its particular way of charging. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of Lamborghini, one of those adventures that shows how far an idea can go when it is defended with character. Tell me in the comments which part of this journey surprised you the most, and which brand you would like us to explore in the next documentary. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe so that you do not miss the upcoming stories. Good night.